Okay. Well, thank you very much for letting me participate. And I know I have quite a lot of expertise out there in the crowd, so that I'll try and be quick and allow time for conversation at the end. I think we're still figuring out the intersections between agroforestry, gender, and climate change mitigation in particular. So it's important to get input from many people, I think, at this stage. What does it mean to say that tree tenure is gendered? In short, it means that you cannot walk into a farm landscape and ask who owns this land and understand everything about the access and use rights, the management responsibilities, issues of control as they differ among men and women, wealthy farmers, poor farmers, older and younger people. And in fact, a couple of scholars from ICRF 15 years ago began breaking down tree tenure in terms of the different spaces used by men and women, looking at common pool resources, but also hedgerows and understories and other areas that they called in-between spaces in farm landscapes. Difference between men and women in the different species that they had some measure of management responsibility or control over, different tree products as well, and interestingly for the climate change discussion, different access and use rights, management responsibilities by season, or varying in times of crisis, where access rights might be loosened or tightened depending on the nature of a particular crisis. So in other words, gender tenure, tree tenure, is quite complex. And a colleague some 15 years ago sketched out all the differences between men and women in the tree products and species and spaces that men and women controlled or had responsibility for or contributed labor to. And you can look at that more closely later if you want to download it. What has changed perhaps in the 15 years since those agroforesters began looking at tree tenure in this more complex way? We've probably seen a shrinkage of common lands and the spread of market relations. There have been physical changes in the landscape, and I was noticing with presentation by Eduardo on cocoa, the way that maybe cocoa systems have led to a shrinkage in the diversity of resources and perhaps access and use rights that women might enjoy in a farm landscape. But there have also been social changes. The titling of property has pushed forward in a lot of areas. And again, titling hasn't often recognized the kind of use and access rights that women enjoy in more complex farm landscapes. And then there's also a concern that women's labor time is getting stretched to breaking points, where agroforestry systems that are introduced call on women's labor without necessarily providing women concomitant benefits. Still, with this changed landscape and under different social circumstances, I believe that men and women are still negotiating tree resource tenure. I want to focus on two of these bullet points in particular. There's been a spread of women's groups, which has given women leverage and asking for or demanding that their use and access rights, their managerial responsibilities be protected in these changing farm landscapes. I will say, on the other hand, that groups are sometimes mobilized for labor, and if the benefits, again, aren't attached to that labor, women's groups can be used in some sense against women's interests. And then two, expanded recognition of community control over farming landscapes. C4 just put out a publication that talked about the devolution of control over community forests and to some extent forest farm landscapes. And this can be, again, a double-edged sword. It can offer women a chance to exert more control over the resources in the landscape, but it can also allow senior men, powerful elites, to close off access to important resources. How does climate change fit in? Just to pick on a couple of potential issues. For mitigation in particular, with the increased involvement of private companies or international finance organizations, there may be a push for contractual arrangements with communities. And what makes for a good contract? It may be a desire for a single signee or payee for that contract, and it may be beneficial to have the agricultural system reduced down to its simplest form, so that greenhouse gas emissions can be measured efficiently. In other words, the involvement of private sector interests in greenhouse gas mitigation may push for a reduced complexity in farming systems and for concentrated tenure and concentrated decision-making authority around agricultural landscapes. We might say, too, that the sense of urgency and the desire for large-scale interventions to address climate change probably mitigate against the kind of careful negotiations that have protected the kind of less visible use and access rights of women in agricultural landscapes. So what approaches are needed then? I think CCAFS, CARE, WOCON, many other organizations are looking at the approaches that I'm going to talk about now as a way to protect women's interests in climate change oriented projects and in agroforestry landscapes. So just quickly, we have to look and see what the various use and access rights are, the management responsibilities are, and take those into account. As one of the earlier speakers mentioned, there should be an emphasis on procedural justice so that men and women can negotiate fairly over complex tree tenure. CCAFS in particular has been promoting experimental, adaptive, and learning-oriented approaches to changes in agricultural practices. And they're quite keen, as I think the first speaker mentioned, to have this work at the local level, but also within institutions in local government, the non-governmental organizations, within donor institutions as well, and then across those scales. So creating these learning platforms for all the stakeholders to become involved is one of the emphases. And finally, maybe strengthening capacity of women in their groups is a key effort being made by a number of non-governmental organizations and research institutions. So I'm going to stop there and ask the various participants to weigh in. Again, feeling that I need a lot more field-based material to flesh out these points and arguments. The questions I have are these: are we seeing that titling programs are simplifying tenure arrangements? And if so, what are the impacts on women? And our climate change mitigation projects in particular pushing for simplified tenure. Are the climate change mitigation projects leading to a more homogeneous landscape with fewer resources that women can claim? On the other hand, does the uncertainty of climate change and the newness of some of the technologies being introduced open opportunities for men and women to renegotiate gender relations? One of the groups that we're working with in Honduras has talked about how experiments at the local level with seed varieties has changed the way that men and women see themselves as farmers, and has allowed women to take a more assertive role in defining what plants should be planted, and what the purposes and uses of various plants in the farming landscape should be. So if you have some thoughts on that, I would love to hear them, and I hope I've finished in enough time to allow for some discussion.